Good. All right, so that's basically the racist argument. Heritability of IQ is high. There are large genetic differences between racial groups. For example, African Americans score on average lower on IQ tests than Caucasians. Thus, lower intelligence is genetically determined in African Americans. Thus, it's a waste of resources or time to try to have them in North America or elsewhere. That's the logic. Now, I tell you right away, it's completely flawed. There are many, many reasons. So we're going to go through the reasons, and let's see. So the first issue, is there really genetic variance among humans that could explain IQ score differences? I'm curious what you guys know about this. How variable are we as a species? How many of you are biologists? Kind of. Okay. How many of you have had animals at home? So good. Yeah, I'm glad to be able to. This is my family. Our house is a zoo. So anyway, let me just okay. So the point is that our species is very unusual compared to many other species. We are not the only ones, but we are certainly one of the very few examples. Cheetah is another species which is highly genetically homogeneous. We are one of the most genetically homogeneous species. So, and that's because of what we call genetic bottleneck. So this is a nice cartoon illustrating what a genetic bottleneck is. This is the starting population with all kinds of genetically variable individuals. Due to this bottleneck, meaning an extinction, close extinction event, when the population size of humans went down to a couple of dozen individuals. There was a time about 150,000 years ago when our species almost died out. So remember, Homo sapiens is about 200,000 years old, and about 50,000 years after modern humans evolved, there was this huge bottleneck. Almost all of us died out. So only a few genetic variants remain, meaning we lost our genetic variability. Now, you would say 200,000 years is a lot of time, but actually from an evolutionary perspective, in terms of the mutation rate that generates genetic variability, it's not a long time. So our species is genetically highly homogeneous. Yeah, there are differences among us. Each of us is unique. We have different hair colors, different skin colors. But fundamentally, if you look at the 25,000 genes or the nucleotide sequence of our genome, there's not a lot of variation. Not a lot compared to many other species.
So put a number to it, what would it be? Less than 1%?
It depends how you count it. So remember, I'm not going to give you a number because it depends on how you sequence DNA and what you regard as meaningful difference. There's a large proportion of our genome is junk DNA where difference make no effect. Other parts which are highly important coding regions of genes, a tiny difference can make can have a huge effect. So it's a complicated question that I cannot really answer now. I don't want to give you a number. Anyway, but it's a good question. It's just difficult to answer. All right. Second problem, and this is a particularly interesting one. What is a race? How do we define a race? So here's an example for you. Who is he? Who is Barack Obama?
President of the United States.
Yeah, unfortunately not anymore, but used to be. So when you ask, why is he a historical figure? There's there are many reasons why he is historically so important, but what is the single most unusual and important historical fact about Barack Obama being president? What is it? First what?
Blackish president.
Okay, good. So you killed my point. Because if I ask this question for my students, all of them say what? He is the first African American president of the United States of America. Okay? Exactly. So from a geneticist viewpoint, you would have to say he is the first F1 hybrid between white and black parents. So there is this is actually sounds funny, but actually this is really one of the fundamental issues with defining race. He is at least 50% Caucasian from a geneticist viewpoint. Okay? So
Non-white.
here's another point, which a lot of people don't know. But if you go to a Royal Ontario Museum and you look at, they have some figures exhibiting different racial people from different racial groups, Africans, this and that. What you're looking at is a bunch of photographs of people from Africa. Now, it's a lot of photographs, and we're not going to go through that. But if you imagine the continent, Africa, and if you imagine it about 100,000 years ago, it's a gigantic landmass where people will not be able to cross from one location to the opposite end of the continent, north, south, east, west. So all people who evolved in Africa evolved locally, isolated from each other. There was a huge isolation among these tribes or local populations. And because the people who are from Africa originally had 200,000 years from the birth of our species to evolve there in an isolated manner, there are huge genetic differences among these African tribes, relatively speaking, compared to every other people on Earth. So when you look at an African from Africa and you call it an African, that's meaningless, because that African can differ genetically from another African person a lot more than I differ from a South Korean person. And the reason is very simple. About 70, 80,000 years ago, and now it's actually questioned. The latest evidence is that we started to migrate out of Africa even longer time ago, but not much longer time ago. So maybe 100,000 years ago. When we started to migrate out of Africa, the number of people who successfully colonized other regions of the world was very small initially. So we went through, those of us who left Africa, a huge genetic bottleneck. So imagine, 50 people making out of Africa to, let's say, Europe, branching in different directions, some of them going east towards Asia, others settling down in Europe. Those 50 represent the genetic variance, the source of all genetic variants from which then Asians, Europeans evolved. And 100,000 years or 130,000 years is not a lot of time to generate a lot of genetic variance. So because of this so-called genetic founder effect, a German is much more closely related to a Korean or Japanese, genetically speaking, than two Africans from Africa to each other. Bottom line, there's no such race as African. There are a huge number of genetically distinct subgroups that are much more different genetically from each other than everyone else in the world. Okay? So the two reasons why it's not biologically meaningful to define a race the way we do is one, hybridization, mixing among major racial groups in a modern society, and two, the origin of Africans, the ancient origin of Africans. All right, so the point is, there are huge genetic differences among African populations, much smaller genetic differences among non-African populations, and mixing among races, leading to what most people don't understand or didn't know, but now we do. There is a lot larger genetic variability within a race that we call a race than between races. So from a biologist's viewpoint, distinguishing racial groups is meaningless. I do a lot of experiments with inbred strains in my laboratory. So if I have a black mouse and a white mouse, I know that they are genetically distinct. And within a black strain, like C57 black 6, it's an inbred strain, there's no genetic variance. So they are like monozygotic twins, infinite source of genetically identical individuals belonging to that particular strain. Same way, the white mouse could be, another strain, and And so I can compare these because I know that they're genetically distinct. I cannot compare racial groups because they are not genetically distinct. There's more variability within a race than between genetic difference between races. So it's meaningless. All right, so that was the second problem with the IQ issue. Remember, the point was that African Americans are genetically distinct. They have lower IQ, and because IQ is heritable and they are genetically different, they are doomed. They're not different genetically. So the IQ difference must be coming from somewhere else, if indeed there is a difference. It's not genetics. Okay? All right, here's another problem. Oops, sorry. So when you measure, just don't look at this, just look at me for now. So measuring behavior is not easy. I have two students here, they can attest to that fact. It's not easy to measure behavior. There has to be a definition, has to be precise tests. And even when you have a precise test, you don't know what exactly you are measuring. So a lot of people think that we can measure learning or memory, but in fact what we can measure is the performance of the animal in a learning task. What that performance depends on could be a lot of things, not just learning itself or memory itself. So complex functional aspects of this organ inside your skull are very difficult to measure precisely and interpret precisely. It's not like you measure your height or your weight, which is relatively easy. IQ testing is the same. It's a construct that measures some aspects of your intellect, some aspects of your cognitive abilities. But how you assemble that battery of tests, because it's like a number of questions, a battery of tests basically, will give you different answers depending on how you put that together. IQ testing was originally meant to walk away from factual knowledge. So your education and knowledge in theory shouldn't matter. So it shouldn't matter whether you were born in the US and you know your president, or if you were born in Hungary and you should know all the previous party leaders, the names of these guys. IQ test doesn't test this kind of factual knowledge, but it does test certain aspects of your cognition in particular ways. Now it turns out that there are many aspects to cognitive abilities, not just those that the standard IQ test tests. The IQ test lines these up in a linear fashion. So basically you have a single linear scale from 0 to 150. 0 meaning you don't have a brain. 100 means that you are on average okay, and 150 means that you are a genius. So, but in reality, it's a really multi-dimensional problem. There are many aspects to cognitive abilities. Your memory, what and how you can remember, what and how you can learn, how quickly you learn, how long you remember, whether you have photographic memory, whether you can rotate things in a 3D, in space. All kinds of ways you can think about cognitive abilities. And there's not a single person, not two persons, who would solve a learning or memory task exactly the same way. So depending on your personal features, you can be successful and very intelligent in many different ways. The IQ scoring test forgets about this. And what's interesting is that the IQ test works best in Western societies.
Yes.
And somehow other cultures, people from other cultures don't perform so well in the IQ test. Also, the IQ test works best for males, particularly white males. White males always perform really well on the IQ test. Can you guys guess who was the designer of the IQ test? Where was he from? What gender he was, and what skin color he had? White, a Caucasian Westerner male. So the IQ test is biased. Not a lot, but enough. So people from other cultures will not perform as well as a white Caucasian man. Yes, ma'am.
What if a person can't read? Then they bomb the test.
Right. So the IQ test has there are some non-verbal, non-language based intelligence test. It's a very good question. So there are forms of that, but even that again is a bit biased because it's all designed for me basically, for us white guys. So
Has there ever been an evolution of the IQ test as a global? That would be right.
people keep trying to revise and improve this, but again, I don't know if there is a true answer to how to do this. Point is that it's still considered a fairly biased test. So it has a very good core component that will distinguish really intelligent from really not intelligent people, but anything in between, it's a big question mark. So whether you are 120 or 115 or 110, the heritability of IQ basically cares about these kind of small differences that the IQ test cannot really specifically address. So, all right. So we cannot really measure intelligence in an objective manner. Okay. So where is the IQ difference coming from then? If it cannot be genetic, what could explain that? Well, here is an explanation. This is something that a lot of people who cite, those scientists who cite data and find evidence in quotation marks, for lower IQ among ethnic minorities, they don't admit this. But we cannot separate environmental effects from genetic effects. We know that genetic effects cannot explain this because we already discussed them. So it must be environmental, but when we compare populations of people, it's very difficult to control the environment. It's impossible to control the environment, and it's impossible to separate these effects. So here's a swimming pool in Detroit Public School. Can you guys see the difference? That explains everything that these so-called genetic studies find. If you are in an affluent suburb, mostly white, versus if you are in an inner city school, it's a huge difference in education. Huge difference in terms of how, what kind of environment, what kind of enrichment from the environment these children receive or not. All right, so this one is an interesting one. Let me ask you guys, how many of you have taken genetics course? Okay, good. I'm happy that my students did. Okay, online, good, very good. So this is going to be a little bit sciencey, but I want to make a point about this. So heritability is a term that we all use in colloquial sense, in everyday language. We think we know what we are talking about. It's a scientifically defined term. The definition is very simple. Heritability is the ratio between genetic variance and genetic variance plus environmental variance. That is total phenotypic variance. In other words, heritability tells you what proportion of the phenotypical variance is explained by genetic differences. Okay? So if you look at us, now look around, we see skin color differences. We see hair color differences. Some people have this hair, that hair. Others have lighter, darker skins. So if you look at these, if I were to actually measure your skin tone, we would get some sort of variance. That would be genetic variance and environmental variance added together. Because some of your skin tone differences may be due to your ethnic origin, whether you are African American, African Canadian, whether you have Indian, East Indian parents or origin, whatever it is, there can be a lot of reasons why your skin tone differs from another person's. So that's your genetics. And there are genetic differences among us. The other reason why your skin tone may differ is because you went to a vacation and you were on the beach for 2 weeks and you tanned a lot. Now it sounds trivial, but that's your environmental contribution to your skin tone. So if I were to measure your skin tone now, let me ask you this. what would be the heritability of skin tone during winter time? How much the sun influences your skin tone during winter? Zero to maybe a little. So let's say 0. Okay? So the heritability estimate, if I were to measure it today, would be what? Genetic variance divided by genetic variance, because the environmental variance is 0. So what does it give you? 1 for 100%. So if I were to calculate heritability for you today, for this population at this time point, heritability would come out to be 100%. Okay? Right. Now imagine if I were to hold the same lecture during July, and some of you were just coming back from your vacation. What would be the heritability estimate? Much less than 100%, because the environmental component would be there. Okay? So the point is, heritability depends on, it's not like a fixed value. It depends on when and how you measure it and what population you use. Because if I were to select only, let's say, African Americans, then I would get no genetic variance. If I were to select Caucasians during summertime, then 100% of the variance would be due to environmental variance, meaning heritability would be 0. Point is, all of the way you measure these things will influence the value of heritability. So let's assume we have 0 heritability, meaning I got Caucasians, and all of them were white, and I tested their skin tone during summertime. And I get 0 heritability because everything that varies comes from the environment. Heritability is 0. When heritability is 0, most people assume that that means that genes have no effect on skin tone. Is this correct? Why? No, you cannot. No. This kind of inheritance would be kind of a Lamarckian method. No, it doesn't exist.
We selected a population.
So I selected a genetically homogeneous population. That's right. So I selected genetically. So I'm setting this question up deliberately this way. I selected the genetically homogeneous population. And now I measure the effect of the environment, variable effect. I found 0 heritability. Does it mean that genes have no effect on skin tone? Okay. Say it again?
You're still going to have some sort of statistical distribution.
Okay, yeah. Okay, let me ask Omna. Let's see if she remembers.
I think no, even within our population, there's one gene that sort of allowing for that skin tone in that population.
Okay, all right, good. So, anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
Well, aren't you, with the homogeneous group, actually measuring the environmental aspect?
Yes.
So,
Yeah. So there's no genetic variance, only environmental variance. Does it mean that there's no gene effect?
no,
Why not?
because
It's really, actually, it's very funny, very simple. Go ahead.
it has to be hidden in the equation.
Okay. So I give you an example and it will become clear, okay? So this is the mistake that James Watson made. One of the most fundamental, ridiculous mistakes a geneticist can make, not understand what heritability is. Listen to this. Let's say I'm a billionaire. Okay? I have unlimited amount of money. And I today decide that I give you, each of you, I give $100,000. Okay? Each and every single one. Is there any variance in how much I gave you? You all got 100,000. So that is basically genetic, lack of genetic variance. Does lack of variance in the amount of money that I gave you mean that I didn't give you any money? No. Just because there's no genetic variance, it has got nothing to do with whether genes affect that phenotype or not. It just means that the genes have no differential effect. They can affect the phenotype really very strongly, but it doesn't vary. In fact, that's the point about strong natural selection. If there is very strong natural selection, that eliminates genetic variability, because only one type of gene effect is acceptable by evolution. So lack of genetic variance means the exact opposite of what most people think. It means strongest genetic effects. Did you guys get this? Lack of variance in the amount of money I gave you doesn't mean I didn't give you money. It just means I gave you the same amount. Lack of genetic variance doesn't mean that genes don't have an effect. It just means that the gene effect is the same for every single one. If the gene effect is the same, it means it's a very important effect. Because natural selection did not allow any variance in that gene effect. It had to be perfectly right. Okay? So when James Watson thinks that heritability estimate being high means strong genetic effect, he completely misunderstands what heritability means.